Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Ready to go deep with me again today.
Always.
Awesome. So today we're going to be traveling back in time to 1988,
Oh, wow.
a pretty pivotal year for Indigenous rights globally. And our primary source for this journey is going to be the IWGIA yearbook from 1988.
Okay.
Now, for those who may not be familiar, IWGIA stands for the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs, and they've been a leading advocate for Indigenous people's rights for decades.
Yeah, they have a long and really impressive track record.
Absolutely. So this yearbook, it's like a time capsule, right? Packed with firsthand accounts, reports, analyses that give us this really unique snapshot of what was going on in the movement at that time.
Yeah, it's almost like we're getting to eavesdrop on history in a way.
Exactly. And right from the start, you'll notice something really interesting about this yearbook.
What's that?
It's not just written about Indigenous peoples, it's filled with their own words and perspectives.
Well, that's a big shift. You know, for a long time, research and advocacy relating to Indigenous communities was often done to them rather than with them. But in 1988, we see that starting to change. Indigenous organizations are becoming more established, more vocal. They're taking control of their own narratives and advocating for themselves on a global stage.
And they weren't holding back either.
No, they weren't.
The yearbook lays bare the harsh realities these communities were facing. Dam projects, flooding ancestral lands, mining operations, polluting water sources, and logging decimating rainforests.
Yeah, and we can't forget about forced relocation, which tore communities apart and caused immense hardship.
Uh,
One example that comes to mind is the Hoppedine situation at Big Mountain in the USA.
it's a stark reminder that these aren't just abstract concepts. We're talking about real, tangible issues with real consequences.
Absolutely. These are people's lives we're talking about.
Exactly.
Mm.
And one of the most disturbing accounts in the yearbook is about the Yanomami people in Brazil, gold miners, invading their land, polluting their water, committing acts of violence. It led to illness and death.
Yeah, that's one of the cases that really stayed with me. It really highlights the human cost of these conflicts.
It's heartbreaking, and it makes you question the whole idea of progress. You know, we often hear about economic development,
Right.
but at whose expense?
Exactly.
Take Malaysia, for example. In 1988, they were the world's leading producer of tropical timber.
Mm.
But this economic boom came at a steep price, massive deforestation that displaced indigenous communities who relied on those very forests for their survival.
Yeah, it's this constant tension between economic growth and indigenous rights. And it plays out in various ways throughout the yearbook. It really underscores the global nature of this struggle.
So speaking of global connections, the yearbook documents the establishment of the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations back in 1982.
Oh yeah, that was a major step forward.
Definitely.
This working group gave indigenous groups a platform to voice their concerns directly to the UN, and it eventually led to efforts to draft a declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples.
Wow. So having a seat at the table where decisions about their future are being made. That's huge.
It is. It's a recognition of their right to be heard.
It's inspiring to see how Indigenous activism was gaining momentum even in the face of, ongoing oppression. There were hard-won victories, but also heartbreaking setbacks.
Definitely. One victory that stands out is the revision of ILO Convention 107, which dealt with indigenous and tribal populations.
Mm.
During this revision, indigenous representatives fought hard and successfully to have the term peoples recognized instead of populations.
Hmm. Why was that distinction so important? It seems like a pretty small detail.
Oh, it's anything but a small detail. The term peoples carries a lot more weight under international law. It implies a right to self-determination that populations just doesn't have. So it was a strategic move on their part to gain more autonomy and control over their own destinies.
So it wasn't just semantics, it was about power.
Exactly.
Interesting. And on that note, the yearbook also mentions a proposed UN study on treaties, specifically focusing on how many historical agreements with indigenous nations had been broken.
Yeah, this is a huge point of contention. Many states resist recognizing these treaties as binding agreements under international law. You know, it's a reminder that colonialism isn't just a thing of the past. Its legacy continues to shape the present.
Right, it's like a wound that hasn't fully healed.
Yeah, exactly.
And it brings us to the concept of self-determination, which is a recurring theme throughout the yearbook. So what does self-determination actually mean for indigenous peoples?
It's about having control over their own destinies. It means having the power to make decisions about their land, their resources, their culture, their governance, free from external control. Imagine being able to shape the future of your community based on your own values and traditions. That's the essence of self-determination.
But achieving that kind of autonomy requires more than just words. It requires action. And the yearbook offers glimpses of the diverse actions being taken from protests to legal battles to international advocacy.
Yeah, the range of tactics employed is really striking. We see indigenous communities engaging with governments, forming alliances with NGOs, and leveraging the power of international organizations like the UN and the ILO.
And they're doing all of this while facing immense challenges, poverty, displacement, even violence.
It's true. The perseverance and resilience of these communities is remarkable. It speaks to the strength of their cultural identity and their determination to secure a better future.
Absolutely. So I think we've laid some good groundwork here.
Yeah, we've got a good foundation.
Let's take a closer look at some of the specific threats that indigenous communities were facing back in 1988. The yearbook paints a pretty sobering picture.
It does. It really does.
So let's unpack that. What were some of the most pressing dangers highlighted in the yearbook?
Well, one thing that really jumps out is the sheer scale of violence against indigenous communities.
Yeah, the yearbook doesn't shy away from that.
Not at all. In fact, it specifically categorizes the threats.
Yeah.
And one of the most disturbing is mass killings. We're talking about incidents in places like the Chittagong Hill Tracts, East Timor, Guatemala, Peru. The list goes on and on.
It's hard to even fathom the scale of it, and it's not just happening under dictatorships.
No, you're right. It really challenges that assumption that certain forms of government are inherently protective of indigenous rights. The yearbook makes it clear that oppression can happen anywhere.
Regardless of political systems.
Exactly.
So another category that's mentioned is the targeted killing of indigenous leaders and the invasion of their communities.
Yeah. It might not be on the scale of mass killings, but it's still incredibly damaging.
Absolutely. It's a tactic designed to dismantle resistance.
Exactly. By eliminating leaders and instilling fear, it becomes much harder for communities to organize and advocate for their rights.
And the yearbook provides examples from all over the world: Chile, Paraguay, Mexico, Tanzania, Kenya.
It's a global problem.
It really is. And these are just the reported cases.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's likely that many more incidents went undocumented.
Especially in remote or politically volatile regions.
Exactly. So official statistics don't always tell the whole story.
Right. We need to listen to the voices of the people themselves.
Absolutely. And rely on the reports of human rights organizations working on the ground.
To get a more accurate picture.
Yep.
So the yearbook also sheds light on the role of international institutions in perpetuating these injustices.
How so?
Well, it highlights how organizations like the World Bank often funded projects that displaced indigenous communities or caused environmental destruction, all in the name of development.
Oh, wow. So these projects that were supposed to be helping were actually harming.
Yeah, it's a pretty harsh critique. The yearbook specifically mentions the World Bank's involvement in projects in Brazil, Paraguay, Indonesia, and India.
Okay. And was the World Bank aware of these consequences?
Well, the yearbook acknowledges that they were starting to rethink some of their policies.
Okay.
But the damage had already been done.
Right.
And let's not forget the role of multinational corporations.
Oh, of course.
In exploiting indigenous lands for resources like oil, minerals, and timber.
Right. The pursuit of profit often comes at a cost. And that cost is often borne by indigenous communities.
Exactly. The yearbook calls out companies like Shell for their operations in the Amazon rainforest.
Yeah, those operations often had devastating environmental and social impacts.
Right, and it's the indigenous communities who are left to deal with the consequences.
Absolutely. The deforestation, the pollution, the loss of their traditional ways of life.
The yearbook refers to this as the myth of development.
What does that mean?
Well, it argues that many of these projects prioritized economic growth over cultural preservation and environmental sustainability.
So it's questioning the very definition of progress.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's a perspective that's incredibly relevant today.
Yeah, as we face the urgent need for more sustainable and equitable models of development.
Absolutely. So we've talked about international colonization.
Right.
But the yearbook also points to another form of colonization happening within countries themselves.
Oh, interesting. What do they call that?
They call it transmigration or state colonization.
Okay, and what does that entail?
Essentially, it's the practice of relocating populations, often from more densely populated areas, to indigenous territories.
Okay, I see. So like an internal form of colonialism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Indonesia is a prime example. The government was moving large numbers of people from Java to other islands.
Including West Papua.
Yeah.
And what was the rationale behind these relocations?
The stated goal was often to alleviate poverty or develop underpopulated regions.
Oh.
But in reality, it often resulted in the displacement and dispossession of indigenous communities.
So it was a way for the dominant group to expand its control over indigenous territories.
Exactly. And the yearbook cites the Chittagong Hill Tracks again as an example of how transmigration can lead to conflict and violence.
It's a reminder that even well-intentioned policies can have devastating consequences.
Right, especially when they fail to consider the rights and needs of indigenous peoples.
The yearbook also highlights the issue of militarization
Oh, right, where
Yeah.
governments use military force to control indigenous populations.
and suppress dissent.
This was happening in Guatemala.
Right, where the military was engaged in that brutal counterinsurgency campaign.
Yeah, and indigenous communities often got caught in the crossfire,
The military often viewed them with suspicion,
seeing them as potential allies of the guerrillas.
or simply as obstacles to development.
It's a chilling example of how state power can be used to silence and marginalize indigenous populations.
Absolutely.
So another recurring theme in the yearbook is the struggle for land rights.
Yeah, it seems to be a fundamental issue for indigenous communities all over the world.
Absolutely. Land is not just a resource for them. It's deeply intertwined with their cultural identity, their spirituality, their very existence.
Losing their land means losing a part of themselves.
Exactly. The yearbook documents numerous examples of how indigenous communities were fighting to protect their land from encroachment by governments, corporations, and settlers.
Could you give us an example?
Sure, the Western Shoshone in the United States were engaged in a long-running legal battle to reclaim their ancestral lands.
Oh, wow. And what had happened to their lands?
The government had taken them over for nuclear testing.
That's awful.
And in Chile, the Mapuche people were struggling to resist land expropriation by logging companies and hydroelectric projects.
It's a familiar story, unfortunately.
It is. The yearbook also highlights the plight of the Ainu people in Japan.
Oh, yes. They were systematically dispossessed of their land during the Meiji era.
Right, and forced to assimilate into Japanese society.
These cases really illustrate the deep historical roots of land dispossession.
And the ongoing challenges indigenous communities face in reclaiming their rightful territories.
It's not just about economic resources either.
No, it's about protecting sacred sites, preserving cultural heritage, and maintaining a connection to ancestral lands.
It's about protecting their history and their future.
Absolutely. So another issue that comes up repeatedly is the erosion of indigenous cultures and languages.
Right, this is often a consequence of assimilation policies, forced relocation, and the pressure to adapt to the dominant culture.
The Ainu people in Japan are a prime example. They were banned from practicing their traditional ceremonies, and their language was actively suppressed.
And we see similar examples in Australia.
Right, where Aboriginal children were often removed from their families
And place and weight institutions.
as part of a government policy aimed at assimilation,
These policies had devastating consequences for generations of indigenous people.
leading to a loss of identity, cultural knowledge, and intergenerational trauma.
It's a tragic reminder of the human cost of these assimilationist policies.
But amidst all these challenges, the yearbook also documents how indigenous communities were fighting back.
Oh, it's good to hear. How so?
They were working to revitalize their languages, preserve their cultural traditions, and pass on their knowledge to future generations.
That's so important. It's a testament to their resilience and their determination to maintain their unique identities.
Exactly. In a world that often seeks to homogenize and assimilate them.
It highlights the importance of supporting efforts to revitalize indigenous languages and cultures,
Not just as a matter of heritage preservation.
but as a fundamental human right.
Absolutely. Now, the yearbook also devotes considerable attention to the efforts of indigenous peoples to gain recognition and support from international organizations.
Oh, right, because that can provide a platform to raise awareness and put pressure on their own governments.
Exactly. The yearbook documents the participation of indigenous representatives at the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations.
Where they presented testimonies and advocated for their rights.
Right. It also highlights the efforts of indigenous organizations to influence the revision of ILO Convention 107.
Which we discussed earlier.
Yeah, and to contribute to the drafting of a declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples.
These international advocacy efforts were crucial for building solidarity among indigenous groups from different countries.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And for bringing their struggles to the attention of a global audience.
They played a key role in shaping the international discourse on indigenous rights.
Paving the way for the eventual adoption of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007.
Wow, so This yearbook really captures a pivotal moment in history.
It does. While it paints a pretty grim picture of the situation facing Indigenous peoples in 1988, it also highlights their resilience, their determination, and their growing influence on the global stage.
It's a year marked by both tragedy and hope.
Exactly. A year that captures a critical turning point in the Indigenous rights movement.
As communities around the world began to mobilize, organize, and demand recognition of their inherent rights.
And the fight didn't end there.
Of course not. The struggle continues,
But the yearbook also showcases the individuals who dedicated themselves to this movement.
both from within Indigenous communities and as allies from the outside.
Yeah, it's so important to remember that behind these large-scale movements are individuals who took action, made sacrifices, and ultimately made a difference.
Absolutely. Their stories are what really bring this history to life.
So who are some of the people that stand out in the yearbook? It's easy to get lost in the big picture, the global scale of these issues, but it's often the actions of individuals that really push things forward. So who comes to mind from the yearbook?
Well, one person who stands out right away is Held Cliven.
Okay, and remind me who he was again?
He was the founder of IWGIA.
Right.
He was a driving force behind the organization's early work, raising awareness about Indigenous issues and mobilizing support for their rights. He really helped put Indigenous rights on the global map.
So a true pioneer in the field.
Absolutely. And the yearbook also talks about anthropologists and the unique role they play.
Oh, yeah, because they have that firsthand experience working with Indigenous communities.
Right. It argues that anthropologists have a responsibility that goes beyond just studying these communities. They need to use their expertise to challenge harmful stereotypes, amplify Indigenous voices, and be true allies in the fight for their rights.
Yeah, it's like a call to action.
Exactly. Urging academics to move beyond observation and engage in meaningful allyship.
So not just studying, but actually doing something with that knowledge.
Exactly. And the yearbook specifically mentions the Declaration of Barbados,
Okay.
adopted by anthropologists back in 1971,
Okay.
as a landmark document outlining this responsibility.
And what did that declaration say?
It called on anthropologists to stand with Indigenous peoples, to oppose the forces that were destroying their cultures, and to support their struggles for self-determination.
So basically using their position to advocate for those who might not have that same platform.
Exactly. It's a powerful reminder that knowledge and expertise should be used in the service of justice and equality.
Absolutely. And the yearbook is full of examples of individuals who were putting these principles into action.
Like Miguel Che Sardi.
Okay.
He wrote this really scathing report on the situation of Indigenous peoples in Paraguay. He exposed the abuses they were facing and called for greater respect for their land rights and cultural integrity.
So he was using his voice to speak truth to power.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we can't forget Claudia Andujar, who tirelessly documented the plight of the Yanomami people in Brazil.
Right, and she was fighting to protect them from the devastating impacts of gold mining.
Yeah, she was a fierce advocate for their rights.
These individuals and countless others like them played a crucial role in bringing the struggles of Indigenous communities to the attention of the world.
They were the unsung heroes of the Indigenous rights movement, working tirelessly behind the scenes to make a difference.
Their stories are truly inspiring. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the IWGIA yearbook from 1988, what's the main takeaway? What should our listener be reflecting on?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway for me is that the fight for Indigenous rights is far from over.
Yeah, the issues highlighted in the yearbook, land rights, cultural preservation, self-determination, these are all still very much at the forefront of Indigenous activism today.
Exactly. It's like this yearbook opened a window into a pivotal moment in history. But the story continues.
It's up to all of us to learn from the past and support those who are still fighting for their rights.
And to work towards a future where Indigenous peoples can thrive and their cultures can flourish. The yearbook offers a glimpse of hope that change is possible.
Yeah, that even when facing incredible odds, the fight for justice and equality can prevail.
Absolutely.
So one thing that really struck me is how the yearbook emphasizes that Indigenous peoples have often been at the forefront of environmental protection.
Oh, that's a great point. They've been advocating for the sustainable use of resources and the preservation of biodiversity for centuries.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, how can we learn from their traditional knowledge and practices to address the pressing environmental challenges we face today?
That's a fantastic question to ponder. The wisdom and experience of Indigenous communities offer invaluable insights into living in harmony with nature. It's a conversation we need to be having now more than ever.
Couldn't agree more. Well, this has been an incredible journey back to 1988.
It really has.
Eye-opening, to say the least.
It's been a privilege to delve into this material with you and to share these insights with our listeners.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.